small German Shepherd puppy tumbled off the side of a bridge, vanishing into the cold water below. Most of the crowd screamed. Some looked away. No one expected to see it again. But hours later, as night fell and search crews packed up, a faint whine came from the woods, and what that tiny creature was dragging behind him left every rescuer frozen in place. Before we get into the full story, tell us in the comments below where in the world you're watching from. And if you love extraordinary animal stories like this one, check out our other channel, where the heroes are cats instead of dogs. Make sure you're subscribed over there too. The link's in the pinned comment. Now back to the story. The rain hadn't let up for hours, and Officer D. Morales was starting to think it never would. His patrol cruiser sat idling beneath the old railway overpass just outside the city limits, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the October downpour that had been pounding the city since dawn. The Weather Service had called it a significant precipitation event, the kind of bureaucratic language that meant everyone was going to have a miserable day. This wasn't his usual beat. Dean should have been making rounds through the school zones and shopping centers on the south side, checking in with the store managers who'd grown to expect his familiar face during their busy afternoon rushes. But something about this quiet stretch of forgotten road always called to him on days like this, especially when the weather turned nasty and the radio chatter died down to almost nothing. Maybe it was the peace, the way the sound of rain on metal created a cocoon of white noise that let him actually think for once. Maybe it was instinct, that sixth sense every street cop develops after a few years of learning to read the subtle signs that something's about to go sideways. After 8 years on the force, Dean had learned to trust those little nudges, even when they didn't make logical sense. He took another sip of his lukewarm coffee, the kind of bitter brew that came from sitting in a thermos for too long, and was reaching for the radio to check in with dispatch when he heard it. Not a splash exactly. Something different, something that made his chest tighten with recognition before his brain could catch up. The sound of something small hitting the water below. Dean had heard that sound before, during his stint with water rescue training 3 years back. Bodies made a particular noise when they hit water from height, different from debris, different from anything else. This wasn't quite that, but it was close enough to send his pulse spiking. He stepped out into the rain, immediately feeling the cold October water soak through his uniform shirt and run down his collar. The current beneath the bridge was running fast and angry, swollen with runoff from the storm that had been battering the region all week. Street flooding had been reported in 6 different neighborhoods, and the emergency services were stretched thin. Dean picked his way down the muddy embankment, boots sliding on grass that had turned treacherous with the constant moisture. His flashlight beam cut through the gray afternoon light, and that's when he saw it. A tiny head bobbing in the churning water. A puppy. German Shepherd, by the looks of it. Maybe 10 weeks old, 12 at the outside. The little guy was paddling frantically with oversized paws, trying to reach the bank, but the current kept pushing him toward the drainage culvert downstream. Dean could see the concrete opening waiting like a hungry mouth. Once the pup got pulled into that tunnel system, there'd be no getting him out alive. In another minute, maybe 2, he'd be swept under and gone forever. Dean didn't think. He just moved. The emergency rescue line came out of his trunk in seconds. Muscle memory from training exercises he'd hoped never to use in a real situation like this. He secured it to the nearest solid tree root, testing the knot twice even though every second counted. The water hit him like a sledgehammer when he entered, freezing, merciless, stealing his breath and making his muscles seize up in protest. But he kept his eyes locked on that tiny head, still fighting, still trying. The puppy's determination was almost heartbreaking to watch. Most animals would have panicked, gone under in the first few seconds. But this little guy kept his nose above water, kept those oversized paws churning, even as exhaustion was clearly setting in. "Hang on, buddy," Dean called out, though his voice was lost in the wind and rain and the roar of the swollen creek. "I'm coming." The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, and colder. Dean had to fight for every stroke, feeling the rope line tug against his safety harness as the water tried to sweep him downstream, too. his boots filled with water, making each kick harder than the last. The cold was seeping into his bones, making his fingers numb and clumsy. The puppy never made a sound. No barking, no whimpering, just that grim, silent determination that made Dean's throat tighten with emotion he didn't have time to process. The little guy was maybe 20 feet from the culvert, opening, when Dean finally reached him, scooping the trembling bundle of wet fur against his chest, just as the current would have claimed him. Getting back to dry ground was the hard part. Dean's hands were completely numb now. His boots kept slipping on the muddy bank, and the puppy was shaking so violently he was afraid the little guy might go into shock right there in his arms. But they made it, both of them soaked and gasping, stumbling toward the patrol car with its promise of warmth and safety. Dean slammed the car door and cranked the heat to maximum, then just held the puppy for a long moment in the back seat. The little guy was shaking so hard, Dean could feel it through his own soaked uniform, but gradually, the violent tremors began to subside as warmth filled the vehicle. He wrapped the pup in his spare flannel shirt, the one he kept in his patrol bag for emergencies, and took his first good look at what he'd pulled from the water. No collar, no tags, nothing to identify him. The puppy's ribs were visible through his matted fur, and not just from being soaked. This was malnutrition. Weeks, maybe months of inadequate food. But it was the eyes that really got to Dean. They were too knowing for a 10-week-old puppy, too steady and focused. Most dogs that young were all chaos and curiosity, bouncing off the walls even in traumatic situations. This little guy looked up at him with an expression that seemed almost evaluative, like he was trying to figure out what kind of person Dean was before deciding whether to trust him. "You've had a rough start, haven't you?" Dean whispered, gently toweling the worst of the wet from the dog's fur. "But you're safe now. I promise you that." The puppy blinked slowly, still watching Dean's face with that unnerving intensity. Then, so quietly, Dean almost missed it. He made a small sound. Not a whimper or a bark, but something softer. Like a sigh of relief. Dean called animal control from his radio, but kept the puppy cradled against his chest while they waited. Something about letting go felt wrong, like breaking a trust that had just been established in the cold water beneath the bridge. When animal control arrived an hour later, the German Shepherd pressed his nose into Dean's wrist and wouldn't budge until Dean personally placed him in the transport crate. "We'll scan for a chip, but given the condition," the technician shook her head. "Doesn't look promising." Dean nodded, watching those intelligent brown eyes track him through the crate door as the van pulled away. Something about the moment felt unfinished, like a conversation cut short in the middle of an important sentence. What Dean didn't know, what nobody could have predicted, was that this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something that would change how their entire department thought about the bond between officer and canine partner. Because that puppy hadn't just fallen from the bridge. He'd been thrown. The rain had finally stopped by Wednesday evening when Dean found himself pulling into the city animal shelter's parking lot for the third time in as many days. He'd been telling himself it was just standard follow-up for an officer-involved rescue, the kind of due diligence the department expected. But sitting in his car, engine ticking as it cooled, Dean had to admit the truth was more complicated than that. Those eyes had haunted him. Not just the intelligence behind them, but the way the puppy had looked at him in those first moments after the rescue. Like he was memorizing Dean's face, filing away every detail for future reference. "You're becoming a regular," April smiled, as he walked through the back entrance of the shelter. The young veterinary technician had gotten used to his visits, no longer looking surprised when he showed up during his off hours. "Just checking on the little guy," Dean replied, though they both knew it was more than that. "How's he doing?" "See for yourself," she said, leading him down the corridor lined with kennels. The difference was remarkable. 3 days of proper food and medical care had transformed the bedraggled puppy Dean had pulled from the creek into something approaching a normal German shepherd pup. His coat had dried to reveal classic black and tan markings, and his eyes were bright and alert rather than dulled by exhaustion. But it was his behavior, that really caught Dean's attention. Most of the dogs in the shelter barked when strangers approached, or pawed at their gates, or showed some kind of excited reaction. The shepherd was different. He sat quietly in his blanket, watching everything with an intensity that seemed almost human in its focus. "He's the quietest puppy I've ever seen," April noted, checking her clipboard as they stopped in front of his kennel. "Barely makes a sound during the day, but watch this." She approached the kennel gate, and the puppy immediately stood, walked over, and sat perfectly. Not the sloppy, wiggling sit of a typical 10-week-old learning basic commands. A trained sit. Precise, controlled, professional. "That's unusual," Dean said, crouching down to the puppy's eye level. The dog's gaze fixed on him immediately, with unmistakable recognition. "He does that for you specifically," April explained, making a note on her chart. "Most of us staff members, he just watches politely. But when you walk down this hallway, he gets up and comes to the gate before you even reach his kennel. It's like he can hear your footsteps from 50 feet away." Dean stayed there for 30 minutes that first visit, hand resting against the kennel gate, having what felt like a conversation without words. The connection wasn't logical. He'd been involved in dozens of animal rescues over the years without feeling this kind of pull. But it was real, and it was getting stronger each day. By Friday, the shelter had completed their full intake process. No owner had come forward despite social media posts and flyers distributed throughout the county. No missing pet reports matched his description. The microchip scanner had come up empty. Without any form of identification, there was no trail to follow, no family to reunite him with. "You thinking about adopting him?" April asked, when Dean showed up on his day off, carrying a bag from the pet store that he'd been trying to convince himself was just for emergency supplies. Dean hesitated, setting the bag down and looking through the kennel gate at the puppy who was, as always, watching him with those steady brown eyes. "I live alone, work 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer when we're short-staffed. It's not exactly ideal for a young dog who's already been through trauma." "But," April prompted, because they both knew there was a but coming. Dean pulled out the contents of the pet store bag. A sturdy rope toy, a well-made leash, a collar that would grow with the puppy, and a bag of the high-quality food the shelter had been feeding him. "But something about him feels right, like we found each other for a reason." He looked at the kennel where the pup sat patiently, tail giving one small wag when their eyes met. "And honestly, I've been thinking about him every day since the rescue. That's not normal for me." The paperwork took 30 minutes to complete. Dean found himself reading every line carefully, as if signing adoption papers was somehow more momentous than any of the other documents he'd signed in his 8 years of police work. Choosing a name took considerably less time. "Rook," Dean said that evening, as they settled onto his apartment floor, the puppy exploring his new surroundings with cautious curiosity. Like the chess piece, strategic, always thinking 3 moves ahead. As if he understood the significance of having a name again, the puppy, Rook now, walked over and pressed against Dean's leg, then looked up at him with what could only be described as gratitude. Over the next week, Dean started noticing things that didn't add up for a traumatized puppy. Rook didn't startle at sudden noises. Not the garbage truck rumbling by at dawn, not the neighbor's motorcycle backfiring, not even the sharp crack of thunder during another storm that rolled through midweek. He didn't chew furniture or shoes or any of the household items that typically became casualties when a young dog was adjusting to a new home. Most telling of all, he walked on a leash like he'd been doing it for months. No pulling, no zigzagging to investigate every interesting smell, no stopping to mark territory every few feet. He walked beside Dean with the kind of disciplined heel that usually took months of consistent training to achieve. "It's like someone already trained him," Dean mentioned to his partner, Officer Torres, during their Thursday evening patrol. They were sitting in the cruiser outside Lincoln Elementary, watching the after-school programs wind down, when Rook, who'd been resting quietly in his specially installed travel crate, suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the playground. Maybe he's got good genes, Torres suggested, following Dean's gaze to where Rook was now sitting at attention, focused on something they couldn't see. German Shepherds are supposed to be smart, right? Smart, yeah, but this is different. Watch this. Dean opened the crate and gave a subtle hand signal he'd learned from observing the K9 unit during joint training exercises. A closed fist raised chest high, followed by a quick downward motion. Rook immediately sat and held eye contact, waiting for the next command. Torres stared. Okay, that's definitely not normal puppy behavior. He knows dozens of signals, Dean continued, demonstrating a few more basic commands. Sit, stay, heel, down. And he responds to whistle commands too. Someone spent serious time training him. So what happened? Why was he in that creek? Dean had been asking himself the same question every night, lying on his couch with Rook curled up beside him, both of them listening to the sounds of the city settling into darkness. Who spends months training a puppy to this level of proficiency, then throws him off a bridge to die? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and in a way that would change both their lives forever. Thursday morning started like any other, with Rook pacing by the front door before Dean had even finished his coffee. Nothing unusual there. The dog loved his walks, but this time felt different, urgent. Easy there, buddy, Dean said, clipping on the leash. We've got time. The moment they stepped outside, Rook froze. His ears shot forward, body rigid with attention. A breeze had shifted, carrying something on the air that Dean couldn't detect, but that hit Rook like an electric shock. Without warning, the dog pulled hard to the left, away from their usual route through the neighborhood park. Rook, heel, Dean commanded, but the dog ignored him completely. This wasn't playful pulling. This was purpose. The same focused intensity Dean had seen in police canines tracking a scent. But Rook was supposed to be an abandoned puppy. There was no reason for him to be displaying textbook tracking behavior, unless there was more to his story than Dean knew. All right, Dean decided, letting the leash slacken. Show me what you've got. They cut through side streets Dean had never explored, down alleys and past abandoned lots. Rook moved with complete confidence, pausing at intersections to test the air before choosing his direction. This wasn't random wandering. The dog knew exactly where he was going. 20 minutes later, they reached the old industrial district on the outskirts of town. Warehouses and storage facilities stretched in all directions, most of them long abandoned. It wasn't the kind of place you'd walk a pet. But Rook pressed on, leading Dean through a gap in a chain-link fence and into a lot filled with shipping containers and rusted equipment. Then he stopped. The blue storage container sat slightly apart from the others, its metal sides streaked with rust and rain stains. Rook positioned himself directly in front of it and sat. That same perfect trained sit he'd shown at the shelter. Dean's pulse quickened. What is it, boy? What do you smell? Rook looked up at him once, then returned his attention to the container, waiting. Dean circled the structure, looking for anything obvious. The metal doors were secured with a heavy padlock, but something caught his eye near the base. A length of frayed rope. The same blue nylon the police department used for training leads. Dispatch. This is Officer Morales, he radioed. I've got a suspicious container at the old Hammond Industrial lot. Requesting backup for a wellness check. While waiting for support, Dean studied Rook's behavior. The dog hadn't moved from his position. This wasn't curiosity or random interest. It was a trained alert. The same kind of alert used by narcotics dogs, cadaver dogs, and evidence recovery canines. You've done this before, haven't you? Dean said quietly. Someone taught you to find things. When backup arrived, it took bolt cutters to get through the lock. The metal doors swung open with a screech that echoed across the empty lot. Inside, the container was dark except for thin shafts of light filtering through ventilation holes near the ceiling. The smell hit them immediately. Stale air, old food, and something else Dean couldn't identify. His flashlight beams swept across the interior, revealing details that made his blood run cold. Blankets piled in one corner, a metal food bowl, and hanging on the far wall, 2 laminated signs secured with zip ties. One showed the police K9 unit logo, the other was a photograph of Rook. The same dog sitting beside Dean at that very moment. Same distinctive markings, same intelligent eyes. But in the photo, he was clean and healthy, wearing a red training harness marked Cadet in training. Jesus, Torres breathed behind him. That's him? Dean nodded, his throat tight. That's Rook. They moved deeper into the container. A plastic folder in the corner contained training evaluation sheets, dozens of them, all stamped with the same conclusion: failure, reassign, or unsuitable for service. At the bottom of the pile was a discharge report that made Dean's hands shake as he read it. Subject K9 to 487B, removed from program following injury during advanced training exercise. Behavioral issues noted, recommended for humane disposal. They were going to kill him, Dean said, the words barely a whisper. And somebody kept him here instead, Torres added, shining her light on the makeshift bedding. How long do you think he was locked up? Dean looked at Rook, who remained perfectly still outside the container. The dog's calm demeanor suddenly made horrible sense. This place wasn't foreign to him. It was familiar. The container had been his world. Long enough to memorize every detail, Dean said, including how to get back here when he needed to show someone the truth. The investigation that followed would uncover a network of off-the-books training facilities and private contractors who took failed police dogs and used them for purposes that would make headlines if the story ever went public. But that was still to come. For now, Dean knelt beside Rook and gently scratched behind his ears. You led us here on purpose, didn't you? You remembered every turn, every scent, every detail of this place, and you came back to make sure we found it. Rook leaned into his touch just for a moment. It was the first time since the rescue that the dog had truly relaxed. As crime scene techs processed the container and its contents, Dean made a decision that would change both their lives. I want him on the team, he told Torres. What team? The K9 unit. He's already trained. He's got instincts you can't teach. And after what he's been through... Dean watched Rook sitting patiently while evidence was photographed around him. He's earned it. By evening, the paperwork was submitted. By the end of the week, Rook would officially join the force as the department's newest four-legged officer. But the real test was still to come, because finding the container was just the beginning. Rook's memory held more secrets, and he wasn't done sharing them yet. The official report would never mention the second location. Internal Affairs sealed those files under a protective classification that kept them away from public records and media requests. But 3 days after they found the container, Rook led Dean to something that changed everything they thought they knew about the scope of what had been happening. It started the same way, with Rook's sudden alertness during what should have been a routine morning walk. This time, though, Dean was ready for it. He'd brought his service radio and had Torres on standby. Where to today, partner? Dean asked, clipping on Rook's new working harness, official department issue, with K9 Rook embroidered on the sides. The dog's answer came in the form of that familiar, purposeful stride, leading them away from the neighborhood and toward the wooded area behind the reservoir. Dean had hiked these trails during his academy training years ago, but Rook navigated them like he'd been here recently. Half a mile in, Rook stopped at the base of a large oak tree. He circled once, tested the air, then looked back at Dean with unmistakable meaning. You smell something, don't you? This time, Dean didn't wait for backup. He followed Rook off the established trail, through dense undergrowth, and down into a natural depression hidden by ferns and fallen logs. What they found there made the container look like a minor discovery. The lean-to was constructed from scrap lumber and plastic sheeting, camouflaged so well that Dean might have walked past it a dozen times without noticing. But the smell gave it away. Bleach, motor oil, and something else that made his stomach turn. Inside was a kennel cage, its door standing open. Scattered around the dirt floor were K9 training patches, torn and discarded. A clipboard sat in the corner with most of its pages missing. But it was the wall that made Dean reach for his radio with trembling fingers. Photos, dozens of them. Pictures of dogs taped to the plywood wall, each one marked with a single letter, F, P, or D. Failed, passed, disposed. Rook's photo was there too, torn in half and crudely taped back together. A red F had been circled twice in permanent marker. Dean keyed his radio. "Torres, I need you at my location now, and bring a crime scene team." While waiting for backup, Dean explored the area around the shelter. Behind it, partially concealed by brush, was a trench filled with charred debris, bones, collars, the remains of animals that hadn't been as lucky as Rook. The dog himself sat quietly at the edge of the clearing, not afraid, but watchful, as if he'd expected this moment and was finally ready to share the full truth. When the investigation team arrived, they found evidence of systematic animal disposal that stretched back at least 2 years. The man behind it was Officer Trent Mallory. Dean remembered the name from Rook's discharge papers, a retired canine evaluator who'd been operating his own consulting business for private security firms. Mallory's method was simple and brutal. Take dogs that had failed official training programs, put them through his own version of advanced evaluation, and dispose of those that didn't meet his standards. The few that survived became part of an underground network of unregistered working dogs. Rook had survived, barely. But instead of being placed with a private client, he'd been held in that container, either as insurance or because Mallory wasn't sure he could trust the dog's loyalty. The bridge incident wasn't random cruelty. It was cleanup. Mallory had decided Rook was too much of a liability and tried to eliminate him in a way that would look accidental. But Rook had survived that too. And now, working with Dean, he was systematically exposing the entire operation. Within a week, Mallory was in custody. The private facilities he'd been working with were shut down, and 17 dogs were recovered from various locations around the state. But for Dean and Rook, the real victory was quieter and more personal. On a sunny Thursday morning, 2 months later, Dean watched Rook complete his final certification exercise with the Department Canine Unit. The dog's performance was flawless, not because he was naturally gifted, but because he'd already endured the worst kind of training imaginable and emerged with his spirit intact. "He's ready," declared Sergeant Williams, the Canine Unit commander. "Official badge number K9847. Welcome to the team, Rook." That evening, Dean sat on his apartment couch with Rook curled up beside him, the dog's new badge gleaming on his collar. The TV was on, but neither of them was paying attention to it. "You know what you did, don't you?" Dean said quietly, scratching behind Rook's ears. "You didn't just survive what they did to you. You came back and made sure it couldn't happen to anyone else." Rook lifted his head and met Dean's eyes with that same steady gaze he'd shown from their first meeting at the shelter. But now Dean understood what he was seeing there. Not confusion or fear or even gratitude. It was recognition. The acknowledgement between two partners who understood that their bond went deeper than training or duty or even loyalty. They'd found each other at exactly the right moment, and they were going to make sure no dog and no handler would have to go through what they'd experienced alone. 6 months later, Dean and Rook were featured in the department's quarterly newsletter. Not as heroes or survivors, but simply as Canine Team 847, Evidence Recovery and Tracking. Their official stats were impressive. A 97% success rate on searches, 3 major cases solved, and 2 commendations for exceptional service. But the real measure of their success was something that would never appear in any report. Every time Dean clipped on Rook's working harness, every time they headed out on patrol together, the dog's tail would wag once, not with excitement or anticipation, but with simple contentment. He'd found his place, his purpose, his partner, and he was exactly where he belonged. On quiet nights, when the precinct was mostly empty and they were finishing up paperwork, Rook would sometimes lift his head and stare toward the exit, not with the longing or restlessness, but with readiness, because both he and Dean knew the truth. Somewhere out there, another container might be waiting. Another dog might need someone to remember where they'd been hidden. Another secret might need to be brought into the light. And when that call came, when duty demanded they follow another impossible trail to another unthinkable discovery, they'd be ready. They always were. Have you ever witnessed the incredible bond between a working dog and their partner? The connection between Dean and Rook reminds us that sometimes the strongest partnerships are forged through shared struggle and mutual trust. What would you have done if you found yourself in Dean's position that day by the bridge? Would you have followed Rook's lead, even when it seemed impossible that a puppy could be tracking something so specific? The most remarkable part of this story isn't just that Rook survived what was done to him, it's that he chose to trust again, to work with humans again, to believe that not everyone would hurt him. That kind of resilience is something we can all learn from. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another incredible tale of canine heroism. Share it with anyone who believes in the power of second chances and the unbreakable bond between humans and their four-legged partners. Check out our other canine stories appearing on your screen now, each one a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes walk on four legs. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another story that proves courage comes in all shapes and sizes.